She looked out the train window, the vast American landscape a blur of greens and browns. A long way from her small German town, from the rubble of her home and the hollow ache of defeat. She was a prisoner of war, one of thousands. But unlike the men, their journey was shrouded in a silence no one spoke about. As the war ended, they were supposed to be repatriated, sent back to a country they barely recognized, a land of ghosts and ruins. A train ticket to freedom. The offer was simple, a return to the homeland. Yet, as the train pulled into the station, a strange and unspoken decision hung in the air. A choice that defied all logic, a plea against the very notion of liberty. Because for these women, freedom wasn't back home. It was here, in the heart of the country they were told was their enemy. It was in the land of their captors. And as the doors opened, they stepped off the train, not towards freedom, but towards a new kind of captivity. One they willingly chose. A captivity of hope, of possibility, of a future that felt impossible back home. The year is 1945. The air in Europe, thick with the stench of gunpowder and defeat, is starting to thin. For the men of the Wehrmacht, the war's end brings the grim reality of prison camps. But for the women of Germany, the war's end brings a different, more complex fate. They were not combatants in the traditional sense, but they were vital to the war effort. Factory workers, nurses, administrative staff, and even a handful of auxiliary personnel who served in uniform. They were the forgotten prisoners of war, a footnote in a history dominated by male narratives. In the chaos of the final months, thousands of them were captured by Allied forces, primarily the Americans. They were sent to temporary holding centers, hastily converted barns and schoolhouses, a world away from the established POW camps for men. The American soldiers guarding them were, for the most part, confused. They had been trained to handle armed combatants, not women who looked like their sisters, their mothers. These women, many of them young, were a paradox. They spoke a different language, carried the weight of their nation's loss, and yet they were just women. Lotte, a 21-year-old from Dresden, was one of them. She had worked at a munitions factory, the deafening clang of machinery her constant companion for 3 years. When the Americans rolled into her town, she was caught in the crossfire, a piece of shrapnel grazing her arm. She was treated, then taken. Her journey through the American-controlled zones was a blur of truck beds and dusty roads. Her destination was a small camp in Bavaria, a former summer camp for children. The irony was not lost on her. The camp, with its small wooden cabins and a mess hall that smelled of pine and boiled potatoes, felt less like a prison and more like a strange, unsettling school. The American guards were at first intimidating, but soon she noticed something different. They were curious, not hostile. They would try to speak with them, using broken German and hand gestures. They offered them chocolate and cigarettes, small acts of kindness that felt almost surreal. They were not the monsters the propaganda had promised. They were boys, barely older than her, with tired eyes and a longing for home. One day, a tall American officer with a kind face and a clipboard stood before them. He spoke in fluent German, a fact that surprised them all. He explained the situation. The war was over. They were to be processed for repatriation. A train would take them to the coast, and from there a ship would sail them back to Germany. The word home echoed in the mess hall, a fragile, almost forgotten concept. Lotte thought of her parents, her younger brother, the house in Dresden she was sure was now just a pile of bricks. The prospect of returning was both a comfort and a terror. What was left to go back to? The officer then added a postscript that would change everything. He told them about a program, a temporary work visa for those who wished to stay in the United States. It was a simple offer, a chance to work on farms, in homes, to help with the American post-war labor shortage. It was a way to rebuild their lives, to earn a living, to exist in a world that was not a ruin. Lotte's heart skipped a beat. The choice was not between captivity and freedom. It was between a known ruin and an unknown hope, a choice that felt like a lifeline. The officer saw the flicker of hope in their eyes, the silent question that hung in the air. He knew that for many of them, the notion of freedom was a luxury they couldn't afford to return to, a paradox that defied all logic. He knew that the hardest part of his job would be convincing them to leave a place they had just arrived at, a place they had been held against their will, but a place that was now offering them a chance to live. The announcement sent ripples through the camp. The women, who had until then lived in a state of quiet resignation, were now buzzing with a strange energy. The question of staying or going became a constant topic of conversation. The mess hall, once a place of silent meals, was now a lively debate hall. The younger women, like Lotta, were the most enthusiastic. They had no homes to return to, no families left to mourn. They saw the United States not as the enemy, but as a blank canvas, a place to start over. The older women were more cautious. They had husbands, children, and parents they had lost touch with. The pull of home, however broken it may be, was strong. They felt a sense of duty, a moral obligation to return to the land of their ancestors, to help with the rebuilding, to be there for what remained of their families. But even for them, the images of a bombed-out Germany, of hunger and destitution, loomed large. They had seen American generosity firsthand. The food, though rationed, was consistent. The beds were clean. The guards, though armed, were human. They had not been abused, not been humiliated. They had been treated with a strange, almost unsettling respect. A respect they knew they would not find in a defeated Germany, where they would be seen as part of the system that had failed, as part of the generation that had lost. Lotta's friend Hilda was among the undecided. Hilda was a few years older, a quiet woman with a sad smile and a deep-seated longing for her family in Berlin. She would spend hours staring at a small photograph of her 2 young children, a photo she had managed to keep hidden through all the chaos. She wanted to go home, to find them, to hold them again. But she also knew that Berlin was a smoking ruin, a city divided by suspicion and hunger. "What if I go back and there is nothing?" she asked Lotta one evening, her voice barely a whisper. "What if they are gone? What will I do then?" Lotta had no answers. Her own family was a ghost story, a series of unanswered letters and a silence that felt final. She had made her decision the moment the officer mentioned the word work. The thought of earning her own money, of being independent, of not being a burden to a crippled nation, was a powerful motivator. "We can make a new life here," Lotta said, her voice full of a conviction she didn't entirely feel. "We can be strong, Hilda. We can be free." But for Hilda, freedom was not a geographical location. It was the ability to hold her children again, to rebuild a life that had been shattered. The American officers tasked with the logistics of repatriation were puzzled by the growing number of women who were openly expressing their desire to stay. The formal process was in place. Repatriation forms were filled out, train schedules were posted. The men were being sent back in droves, a testament to the efficient American war machine. But the women, they were a variable they hadn't accounted for. The American government had a strict policy against keeping enemy combatants in the country. But these women, they were not combatants. They were a gray area, a diplomatic conundrum. The officer who had first addressed them, Captain Miller, was tasked with explaining the complexities. "This isn't a simple choice," he said to Lotta one afternoon. "You will be on a work visa. You won't have citizenship. You will have to abide by American laws. There are no guarantees." He was trying to be fair, to not give them false hope. But Lotta saw something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, a hint of admiration. He saw their desperation, their resilience. He saw that they were not begging to stay out of a desire for a luxurious life, but out of a simple need for survival, a chance to rebuild. He saw that for them, this was a last resort, a final Hail Mary pass to a future that felt attainable. Captain Miller knew that the bureaucracy of both nations would work against them, that there would be hurdles and red tape. He knew that for many of them, their plea to stay would be seen as an act of treason by their own people, a betrayal of the homeland. He also knew that for the American government, this was a public relations nightmare in the making. How do you explain to the American public that you are keeping German women prisoners and that they want to stay? The answer was simple: you don't. The process had to be quiet, discreet. But as the day of the first repatriation train approached, the pleas to stay became louder, more desperate. It was a symphony of hope and fear, a chorus of voices that were not asking for mercy, but for a chance. And in that moment, In the quiet desperation of a small camp in Bavaria, the line between captor and captive began to blur. And the train whistle blew, a mournful sound that was supposed to signal a return home, but for many, it sounded like a final goodbye to the hope of a new beginning. The first repatriation train was a scene of conflicting emotions. Some women, with tears streaming down their faces, boarded with a sense of relief, a desperate need to return to whatever was left of their lives. They clung to their meager belongings, a sense of duty guiding their every step. But for a significant number, the sight of the train was a source of profound dread. Lotta, Hilda, and dozens of others stood on the platform, their feet planted firmly on the ground, a silent protest against a forced return. They had submitted their requests to stay, a simple form with their name, their former profession, and a short, handwritten note pleading their case. The American officers, overwhelmed by the sheer number of requests, were at a loss. They had orders to fill the train, to clear the camp, to send the women back. But they also had a growing sense of unease. They had spent weeks with these women, heard their stories, seen their despair and their resilience. To force them onto a train felt wrong, a betrayal of the unspoken understanding that had developed between them. Captain Miller, his face a mask of frustration, tried to reason with them. "This is not a permanent solution," he said, his voice strained. "The process to stay will take months, perhaps years. You will be in a state of limbo. Go home, see your families, and if the paperwork is approved, you can apply for a visa later." Lotta stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "Captain Miller," she said, her eyes meeting his, "there is nothing to go back to. My home is gone. My family is gone. To go back is to return to a grave. Here, there is a chance to work, to eat, to not be a burden. We are not asking for a handout. We are asking for a chance to earn our keep." Her words were met with a murmur of agreement from the other women. Hilda, her eyes full of a quiet resolve, nodded her head. The American guards, who had been watching the scene unfold, were visibly uncomfortable. They had been given a mission, but their humanity was getting in the way. A young guard, barely 19, walked over to Captain Miller. "Sir, we can't just force them on the train," he said, his voice low. "It doesn't feel right." Captain Miller knew he was right. He couldn't force them. Not without a fight, not without a scene that would draw unwanted attention. He made a snap decision, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. He ordered the train to leave, half empty. He would report the number of women who refused to board as unaccounted for and deal with the fallout later. The train whistle blew a second time, a final long wail that echoed across the platform. As it pulled away, the women who remained let out a collective sigh of relief. They were still prisoners, but they had won a small, significant victory. They had chosen their captivity. The following weeks were a strange, liminal existence. The camp, once a temporary holding facility, was now a long-term residence for a group of women who had no official status. They were not prisoners, not immigrants, but something in between. The American officers, under Captain Miller's direction, had to improvise. They created a makeshift work program. The women were put to work cleaning the camp, mending uniforms, and cooking for the guards. They were paid a small stipend in scrip that could be used at the camp's small commissary. It was a symbolic act, a way to give them a sense of purpose and to make their stay feel less like an act of charity. Lotta and Hilda were put to work in the laundry, the rhythmic scrubbing and folding a form of meditation. They would talk for hours about their hopes and fears, their dreams of a life in America. They would practice their English with the guards, their vocabulary growing with each passing day. They learned words like freedom, opportunity, and hope, words that had felt foreign to them just a few months ago. The American guards, in turn, learned a few German words, a fragile bridge of communication between two people who were supposed to be enemies. The lines of us and them were slowly dissolving, replaced by a shared humanity born out of a shared space. But the peace was temporary. The bureaucracy was catching up. Captain Miller received a telegram from Washington. The military was to be relieved of their duty to manage the women. A civilian organization would be taking over, a group tasked with handling the repatriation of displaced persons. The new directive was clear. All remaining women were to be sent back to Germany, regardless of their wishes. The train was coming again, and this time there would be no choice. The clock was ticking, and Lotta and the other women had only a few days to make their case, to find a way to stay in a country that wanted to send them away. The feeling of hope that had settled in their hearts was now replaced with a deep sense of dread. They had fought so hard to stay, and now it felt like it was all for nothing. The final train was coming, and they knew they had to find a way to stop it. The news of the new directive spread like wildfire through the camp. The tentative peace, the fragile sense of hope that had been so carefully nurtured, shattered instantly. The women, who had been working and living with a newfound purpose, were now thrown into a state of panic. The new civilian officers, a group of stern-faced men and women in suits, arrived with an air of clinical efficiency. They had no time for sentimentality, no patience for the emotional pleas of the German women. They were there to do a job, to clear the camp, and to get the repatriation process back on track. The head of the new delegation, a man named Mr. Thompson, was blunt. "Your requests to stay have been denied," he announced to the women gathered in the mess hall. "You are displaced persons. Your place is in Germany to help with the rebuilding of your country. The train will depart in 3 days. Be ready." The cold, hard reality of his words hit them like a physical blow. The dreams of a new life, of a new beginning, were suddenly just that, dreams. Lotta felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She looked at Hilda, who had tears streaming down her face. "What do we do?" Hilda whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "We can't go back." "I can't." Lotta's mind was racing. She thought of Captain Miller, of the kindness he had shown them. He was their only hope. She found him by the camp office, his face etched with a familiar frustration. "They won't listen to us," she said, her voice trembling. "They say we have to go back. They don't care about our reasons." Captain Miller looked at her with a mix of sympathy and helplessness. "I'm sorry, Lotta," he said. "My hands are tied. My orders are to cooperate with the Civilian Commission. I can't go against them." But Lotta saw a flicker of defiance in his eyes, a deep-seated sense of injustice. She knew he wanted to help. She had to give him a reason to. "Captain," she said, her voice finding a new strength, "the world thinks we are the enemy. But you have seen us. You know we are not. We are just people. We are survivors. We want to work. We want to contribute. We will be a testament to the American spirit, to its generosity. To send us back is to send us to a life of misery. To keep us here is to show the world that America is not just a conqueror, but a savior." Her words struck a chord. Captain Miller knew she was right. He had seen the way they worked, the way they had adapted, the way they had found hope in the most hopeless of situations. He saw the truth in her eyes, the raw, unfiltered plea for a chance. He also knew that he couldn't just defy a direct order. He had to find another way. He began to make calls, to pull strings, to use his military connections. He called his old commanding officer, a man who had a soft spot for soldiers in a jam. He explained the situation, the paradox of the German women begging to stay. He argued that it was a unique opportunity, a public relations win for the United States. He argued that it would show the world that America's victory was not about dominance, but about compassion. His commanding officer, a man who understood the value of good press, was intrigued. He told Captain Miller he would see what he could do, but that there were no guarantees. He was up against a bureaucratic behemoth, a government that was obsessed with returning to normalcy. In the camp, the women were preparing for the worst. They packed their meager belongings, their hearts heavy with a sense of finality. Hilda had given up hope. "It's no use," she said to Lotta, tears in her eyes. "We are going home. I will find my children, even if it is in the rubble." But Lotta refused to give up. She had seen a glimmer of hope in Captain Miller's eyes. She knew he was fighting for them. The day before the train's arrival, Captain Miller came to the mess hall. The women, their faces a mixture of fear and resignation, looked up at him. "I have some news," he said, his voice unusually quiet. "I can't stop the train, but I have found another way. I have secured a small number of temporary visas for a small number of you. The rest of you will still be repatriated." The announcement was met with a stunned silence. It was a compromise, a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The women who had been selected were overjoyed, but their joy was tempered by the sadness of leaving their friends behind. The choice had become even more painful. Who would be chosen? Who would be left behind? The small hope that had flickered back to life was now a source of division and anxiety, a cruel test of their friendships and their faith. The train was coming, and a handful of them would be staying, but at what cost? The final morning was filled with a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Mr. Thompson and his delegation, along with a number of guards, were ready. The women who were to be repatriated stood in a grim line, their faces pale and drawn. The small group of women who had been chosen to stay were huddled together, a strange mix of relief and guilt on their faces. Lotta was among them, her heart heavy as she looked at her friend Hilda, who was standing in the repatriation line. Hilda had not been chosen. The selection process was based on a combination of factors, including age, work skills, and the presence of family in Germany. Hilda's children, though their fate was unknown, were a mark against her. She was needed in Germany, a statistic in a government report, a woman who had a family to return to. Lotta, with no known family left, was a clean slate, a perfect candidate for the American experiment. She approached Hilda, her eyes full of sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Hilda," she said, her voice a whisper. "I wish you were staying too." Hilda looked at her with a sad, understanding smile. "It's all right, Lotta," she said. "You have a chance at a new life. Take it. For me. For all of us." She hugged her friend, a final embrace that felt like a goodbye forever. The train, a long black serpent, pulled into the station. The doors opened with a hiss of steam. The women began to board, their footsteps heavy and slow. Mr. Thompson, clipboard in hand, was calling out names, a quick, impersonal roll call. As he called Hilda's name, Lotta's heart ached. She watched her friend board the train, a small, fragile figure disappearing into the darkness of the train car. The small group of women who had been chosen to stay watched in silent agony, their victory feeling more like a defeat. They had won, but they had lost so much. As the train doors began to close, a voice, a strong, clear voice, called out from inside the train car. "Lotta, don't forget me!" It was Hilda. Lotta ran to the train, her heart pounding. The doors were almost closed. She pressed her face against the window, her hand against the glass. Hilda was on the other side, her face a mask of sorrow and hope. "I won't," Lotta yelled back, her voice breaking. "I'll write. I'll find you." The train gave a final whistle, a long, mournful sound, and began to pull away, leaving a trail of black smoke in its wake. The small group of women who had been left behind stood on the platform, a group of ex-prisoners who were now stateless in a world of their own making. They were free, but they were also alone, their lives now a blank page, a story with no history and an uncertain future. Captain Miller, who had been watching the scene unfold, walked over to the women. "Your new lives begin today," he said, his voice kind. "You will be taken to a transition center. From there, you will be placed with American families who have volunteered to take you in as workers. It will not be easy. You will have to learn a new language, a new way of life. But you have a chance at a life of your own making." The women looked at each other, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. They had no idea what was next. They were heading into the great unknown, a journey that felt even more terrifying than the one they had just escaped. They were no longer prisoners, but they were not yet free. They were in a state of purgatory, a waiting room for a new life, a life they had fought so hard for, but one that was now just beginning, full of uncertainty and a terrifying sense of possibility. And as they boarded the trucks that would take them to their new homes, a new kind of silence settled over them, a silence of anticipation, of hope, and of the profound loneliness that comes with starting over. Lotta, in the back of the truck, looked out at the disappearing train tracks, a physical representation of the life she had left behind. She had no idea when or if she would ever see her friend again. She had no idea if her choice was the right one. She just knew she had to keep moving forward into a future she had created for herself, a future that was both a promise and a terrifying leap of faith. And she knew that the real journey was just beginning. The transition was jarring. From the structured, militarized life of the camp, they were suddenly thrust into the intimate chaos of American family life. Lotta was placed with a family in Kansas, a kind but reserved couple named the Millers, who owned a large farm. Their house was a world away from the rubble of Dresden. It was a sturdy two-story farmhouse, smelling of fresh-baked bread and wood smoke. Lotta was given a small room of her own, with a clean bed and a window that looked out onto an endless expanse of cornfields. Her job was to help with the household chores, to cook, to clean, to help in the garden. The work was hard, but it was honest. And every day she earned her keep. She was not a prisoner. She was a worker. She was a guest. But the cultural differences were immense. The language barrier was a constant source of frustration and miscommunication. She missed Hilda, missed the shared language and the unspoken understanding they had. She felt isolated, a ghost in someone else's life. The Millers were kind, but they were also a mystery. They would ask her questions she didn't understand, their words a jumble of sounds. She would try to respond, her broken English a source of embarrassment. The kindness was there, but so was a quiet distance, a gulf that felt impossible to cross. One evening, Mr. Miller found her crying in her room. He sat on the edge of her bed, his large, calloused hands resting on his knees. "It's hard, isn't it?" he said, his voice gentle. Lotta just nodded, tears streaming down her face. "You miss your home," he said, and Lotta shook her head. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I miss my friend. I miss a life that was here. I feel like I am a new person, but I don't know who she is yet." Mr. Miller nodded in understanding. "It takes time," he said, "to be born again. It takes time." His words, though simple, were a comfort. They were the first words of true empathy she had heard since leaving Germany. She began to write letters to Hilda, letters filled with a mix of wonder and despair. She described the endless fields of corn, the strange food, the kindness of her hosts. She also described her loneliness, her feeling of being adrift, of being a stranger in a strange land. She never received a reply. The letters were lost, or perhaps Hilda never received them. The silence was a constant, painful ache. Lotta had chosen to stay, and in doing so, she had chosen a life without a past. Her new life was a world of possibility, but it was also a world of profound solitude. Over the months, Lotta began to adapt. She learned to cook American food, her hands now moving with a practiced ease through the new kitchen. She learned to speak English, her vocabulary growing with each passing day. The Millers, in turn, began to open up. They told her about their children who had gone off to war, about their hopes and their fears. Lotta shared stories of her own, of her life in Dresden, of the war, of the final days. The distance began to shrink, replaced by a quiet, shared understanding. She was no longer just a worker. She was a part of the family. The years passed. The temporary work visa was extended, and then, miraculously, a path to citizenship was created for her and the other women. Lotta had a new name, a new identity, a new country. She never saw Hilda again. She never returned to Germany. Her past was a country she had left behind, a memory that faded with each passing year. She had begged to stay, and she had stayed. But the cost of that freedom was the loss of everything she had ever known, the severing of the ties that had defined her. Her life was a testament to the strange, beautiful paradox of her choice. She was free, but she was a prisoner of her own making, bound to a new life by a choice she could never unmake. And one day, decades later, a letter arrived, a letter with a familiar handwriting on the envelope, and Lotta's heart stopped. She had no idea who it could be from. And as she tore open the seal, her hands trembling, she knew that the past, the country she had left behind, was not as gone as she had thought.